The Lord be with you. And also with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Glory to you, Lord. Now after Jesus rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when the disciples heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. After this, Jesus appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking in the country. And they went back and told the rest, and they did not believe them either. Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table. And he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who had seen him after he had risen. And then Jesus said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation." The gospel inspired by God. So Mark's is the first of the Gospels written, at least it's the first of the canonical Gospels written in 70 AD. There's evidence that the Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, was written 20 years before it, but that's kind of disputed and it's not accepted into the canon of Scripture. And so of the canonical Gospels, Mark is written about 70 AD. So it's the first one written, and it's the shortest. There's only 16 chapters in Mark's Gospel. And it's a strange Gospel, but it's interesting that it's plagiarized by both Matthew and Luke. When they come to write their Gospels, Matthew writes his Gospel around about 80 AD, and Luke writes about 90 AD, and they borrow huge pieces from Mark. Word for word, they've just borrowed straight out of Mark's Gospel. But at some stage, Mark's original Gospel is edited and redacted, and somebody comes to the conclusion that it's incomplete. You get the impression, in fact, that Mark is a kind of a glass half empty guy. And so there's actually 3 different endings to Mark's Gospel, depending on which manuscript you choose to quote from. So the first ending, is very, very brief and truncated. It says that Jesus only said one thing on the cross. He didn't, say to the good thief, "Today you will be with me in paradise." He wasn't concerned about his mother. "Mother, behold your son, son, behold your mother." He didn't say, "Father, forgive them because they have no idea what they're doing." He did not say, "It is finished, I've completed my mission." He did not say, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He only says one thing in Mark's Gospel, and that is, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." My God, why have you abandoned me? So it ends with Jesus in despair. So if you only had read Mark's Gospel, Jesus comes across as a very human figure who died in despair at the end, thinking that the whole thing was a sham and a hoax. And there are no resurrection appearances in Mark's Gospel. If you go to Mark's Gospel, the story ends with the women going to the tomb, and the tomb is empty. And they're scared, and they run home and say nothing to anybody. That's the end of the original Gospel. There's no appearance of Jesus in the original Gospel. And the women who see the empty tomb don't even report that the tomb is empty. They're scared, and they run home, and they say nothing to anybody. And that's how the original Gospel ends. There are 2 other endings tacked onto it. So what happens is, 40 or 50 or 60 years later, they now start borrowing endings from Luke's Gospel and from John's Gospel, and they tack them on to the original of Mark's Gospel. And so the stories we read today in Mark's Gospel, they're not in Mark's Gospel originally. They're borrowed from Luke and they're borrowed from John. So they borrowed 3 stories. They borrowed 2 stories from John and 1 story from Luke. And so they borrow from John's Gospel that Jesus appeared to Mary of Magdala. You just heard it here this morning. So he appears to Mary of Magdala, firstly, and then we're told he appeared in another form to 2 of them as they were walking along the road. That's borrowed from Luke's Gospel, from Luke chapter 24, the story of the disciples on the way to Emmaus. And then thirdly, he appears to the 11 while they're at table, and that's borrowed from John's Gospel as well. So there's 3 stories of post-resurrection appearances, and they're all borrowed from other Gospels and tacked on to the end of it. And so somebody figured out that Mark didn't finish the project. But you get the impression that whoever tacked them on did a really kind of a hasty job, because they didn't just tack on the originals from John and Luke, they kind of truncated them and made them much, much simpler. And so, for instance, the story of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. as recounted in Luke's gospel. It's a great story. It's a very interesting story. And the story is that on the Sunday of resurrection, 2 disciples are walking from Jerusalem to Emmaus, which is about 6 or 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they're in a very animated discussion, talking about what had happened. And Jesus approaches them, but they don't recognize him. And he catches up with them and he says, "What are you guys talking about? You're really, really animated. What's the deal?" And they say, "Are you the only guy in Jerusalem who doesn't know what's been happening back there?" He says, "No. What's been happening? About Jesus of Nazareth? You didn't hear about Jesus of Nazareth?" "No, who's Jesus of Nazareth?" "Oh, you can't. Go away, smear." And they begin telling Jesus about Jesus. Yeah? And finally, he begins to open up the scriptures and says to them, "Don't you realize that all of this was predicted in the scriptures?" And they're fascinated by his teaching. They come to the village, and he asks us if he's going to keep going. And they say, "No, no, no, no. Come and have a meal with us. It's evening time. Spend the night with us." So they sit down in an inn, and they bring out the bread and the wine, and they ask him to do the bracha, the blessing, the grace before meals. And he does the grace before meals, and all of a sudden their eyes are opened, and they recognize that as Jesus. That's the story that you find in Luke's gospel. Once he breaks the bread, they recognize him. Mark today, whoever does this ending to Mark, adds on, he appeared to 2 other guys on the road. End of story. Yeah. The story of Mary Magdalene. He appeared to Mary, and then she runs back. There's a whole encounter between Jesus and Mary in John's gospel, where she thinks he's the gardener. And she says to him, "Sir, if you've taken the body away, tell me where you put it, and I'll go and I lift it myself." And then he has a dialogue. He just calls her name, and she flings herself at him. And he says, "Mary, do not cling to me, because I haven't yet gone back to the Father." And then the third story about he appeared to the 11 while they were at table. This is taken from John's gospel, and it's a much bigger story again. So whoever added it on is like just took it. "Oh yeah, there's another piece to it. Let's stick this in here." Really, 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 really badly done. Just kind of tacked on. And so it's interesting. Whoever did it did a really poor job. Wasn't a great storyteller. Left all the stories out and just give me the facts, ma'am. Just the facts. Just the facts. But one of the things that strikes me about it is that in this account, all of them are berated for their lack of faith. In John's gospel, only Thomas is the unbelieving one, and the others accept the encounter with Jesus. But in this account, everybody is guilty. So Mary Magdalene comes back and tells them they won't believe her. The 2 guys on the road to Emmaus come and tell them they won't believe them, so they don't believe anybody. And so when Jesus appears to them, finally the 11 at table, notice Judas is missing, there's only 11 there at this stage, he upbraids all of them for their lack of faith. And it always reminds me, my very first homily in Swahili. I was learning Swahili. I went to Kenya in November 1972, and I started learning Swahili. So Easter 1973, I felt like I had enough of a grip on the language to give my first homily. And this was the very first text I used. In Swahili it says, "Heri wale wanao sadiki pasipo kuona." Blessed are those who have not seen but still have believed. So that phrase always rings a bell for me, going back to March or April of 1973. The final thing I want to say is this, that again, when he talks about this story on the road to Emmaus, this version is pathetic. But what it does say is, he appeared to 2 of them in another form. And I was fascinated this morning just by that, in another form. So what was the other form that Jesus was using? So there was something about the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus where he wasn't recognizable. It's like he didn't quite get it right. Whatever he did in reassembling his individual parts, he didn't get it quite right. Is this he? It looks like him. No, but did his nose always bend to the left? There's something they can't figure out with him. Yeah, there's something off about the pictures. Like when he was putting on the pieces, he didn't get them in the right sequence or whatever. And so what does this other form mean? There's a whole teaching in near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences that when you abandon your physical body at death or an out-of-body experience and you inhabit your etheric body, the etheric body is a look-alike. It looks very similar to the physical one, but there's something different about it. It's not quite exactly the same. And so it's a little bit off-putting. So you're wondering, that face is really, really familiar. Have I seen this person before? But not quite. So somehow, in his resurrected state, he's appearing in an etheric form or in his astral body. And while it's similar to his physical appearance, there's something quite off, and he's not quite recognizable. So in John, that was yesterday's Gospels from John. And according to John, he only appeared 3 times. But then you get an account in Luke's Gospel, and you get an account in Matthew's Gospel even as well. So if you add them all together, there's a lot more than that. Yeah. And if you keep going, he appears to Paul on the road to Damascus, which is a few years later. And so if you string them all out, there's about actually 6 or 7 different appearances if you cull all the Gospel accounts. I think it was that there's, you can only encounter Christ in an altered state of consciousness, and there's something about a ritual or something about a spiritual service. It alters your state of consciousness, and then you begin to see differently. So the ritual of the breaking of bread is what triggered an altered state of consciousness in them, and that therefore were in a place where they could meet him where he was at. And that's exactly why the Eucharistic encounters were so important to the early church, because it was in their Eucharist that they were entering a mindset and the altered state of consciousness in which they were having real encounters with him. And so I think for us today as well, I keep using this example. I remember one time a young kid coming up to communion, and he had a wad of chewing gum in his mouth. And it was at the stage when you didn't take communion in your hand, you took it in your mouth. And he comes out, and he's flicking his tongue out, and there's a wad of chewing gum on one side, and I'm putting the host on the other side, and there's just Wrigley's and Jesus wrestling for space inside in the kid's mouth. I'm thinking, did he receive communion? He didn't. He got a piece of bread. But somebody else comes up, really devotionally, and you can see they're in an altered state already, and you give them communion, they're having a real experience of the risen Christ. Really, as really as the apostles did 2,000 years ago, because it's a state of consciousness that allows the communication to happen. That's brilliant. That's brilliant. So everybody hear what Karen was saying? So Karen is saying, calling attention to the fact that Mark's Gospel was written in 70 AD, which was the year that the temple collapsed, in the sense that there was a rebellion against Roman occupation between 66 AD and 70 AD. They held out for 4 years, and by the year 70, the Romans, conquered the city, destroyed it completely, flattened the temple, and this is when Mark is writing his gospel. So you can imagine him saying, my God, why have you abandoned me?" as the last statement that what Christ was making. So he's reflecting the death of Christ with the death of Jerusalem. Yeah, great point. So actual fact, a better translation of that phrase is, he didn't say do not touch me, he said do not cling to me. Yeah. So I think the idea is that this is true of all of us. As we're departing, we're sequentially abandoning different levels of the body. So firstly, we abandon the physical spacesuit. We have no control over that. Nobody can stop that process happening. We abandon we are now in a second level of body called the etheric body. That typically lasts only 3 or 4 days and then gets dissolved back into the universe as free energy. But for those 3 or 4 days, we're in this look-alike energy body, and a lot of people can get addicted to that, and they want to hang around. And we hang around typically for one of 3 reasons. The first reason is that people who are addicted to something about the planet, whether it's an addiction to drugs or an addiction to alcohol or something, that they want to hang around and have a physical body to try to indulge their addiction. That's the first reason. You get discombobulated entities who are earthbound long after they've died, their physical body. The second one is that somebody who is really, really concerned for those left behind, like a mother, let's say, who's died in childbirth, and she's just given birth to a little baby, and she's really freaking out, who's going to look after my baby for me? And so she's earthbound, she's clinging on here because she's concerned about her little baby. And the third one is people who are left behind and wanting to cling on to people who are departed, and not let them go. And you see this, fairly frequently with people who are dying, and those who are left behind, they don't want them to die. Although they're in tremendous pain, their mission is complete, but don't leave us. And even after they've physically died, please don't leave us. So I think that this is what Jesus was saying to Mary Magdalene: do not cling to me. I haven't yet ascended to my Father. I've got to complete my mission totally. When he said on the cross in John's Gospel, it is completed, I've finished it, the completion was he had now left his physical body. But he's going to be in the etheric realm for about a month, according to the gospel accounts. He doesn't want to kind of get stuck there either. That's only a temporary phase where he's trying to shore up the faith of the young community. But he doesn't want to get trapped there either. Now, Mary of Magdala is the person who's probably closest to him in his physical life. And so the temptation for him and for her would be, let's keep this going. And he said, no, there's another phase to my mission. I got to let go of this other level of body and go right back to the first. So don't cling to me. You can give me a hug, I'll give you a hug, but we can't cling to each other anymore. No, it's fine to miss somebody as long as we're not putting any kind of intention out there that they need to come back, and reconnect with us in some level. Now, I think that the departed, the easiest way for them to communicate with us is in a dream state, because the dream state is the third level of body. So the levels of body are in decreasing orders of subtlety. So this is the densest form of the body, the physical body. It's vibrating between 400 nanometers and 700 nanometers, between infrared and ultraviolet. This is the densest level of body. I think myself that creation happens in the following way. Creation is a spiral dance between light and sound. And so, light is that which gives the material form, and sound is that which gives the intelligence. Sound is extraordinarily creative. It creates life forms. And so when it says in John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word is the sound God makes in manifesting. And so when you get sound and light dancing to each other, you're going to get different forms of body. If you get very, very, very subtle sound dancing with very, very, very subtle light, you get angelic beings. If you get very, very dense sound, dancing with very dense light, you get rocks. Someplace in between are human beings. And so our different bodies are constituted from different subtleties of sound dancing with different subtleties of light. Now, the physical body is the densest for human beings. Above that is the etheric. It's less dense, it is more subtle. The astral body is above that, it is more subtle still. And so it's much easier for people who are coming from a totally disincarnate form to get down to our level 3, and then for them to come down to our level 1, which is the physical body. So when they come down to that level, they get it wrong. They get, picked up grandma's eyes or face or whatever en route. But if they're going to have to come down to level 3 for us, it's less of a hassle for them, and so they can make that journey more frequently. And that's the level we are at when we're dreaming. And so very, very often, the easiest place for the dead to communicate with us is in our dream state. We're much more subtle, and they don't have to be quite as dense. Exactly. So you get that very, very often in the dream state, that, I know it was my house, but it didn't look like my house, that kind of sense. But there's a knowing. And the same thing when you meet somebody, I know it's my mother, but it doesn't look quite like her. It didn't quite get it right. So there's a deeper knowing, which is different from just the kind of the dressing that they have to put on to try to make contact.